Good afternoon, class.
Good afternoon, teacher.
This is my 8th lecture in a course of selected readings in British and American poetry. I'll talk about Emily Dickinson this afternoon. This is the agenda prepared for this afternoon. I will pick up where we left last week, talking a little bit more about Walt Whitman. And then I'll introduce the significance of Emily Dickinson and life of Emily Dickinson. And after that, we'll have a close reading of 2 or 3 of her poems. And we'll end up with assignments for next week. First, I would like to invite you to read aloud Whitman's short poem, One's Self I Sing. Are you ready? Okay, now, one's self I sing. 1, 2, 3. One's self I sing, a simple, separate person. Yet utter the word democratic, the word en masse. Of physiology from top to toe I sing. Not physiognomy alone, nor brain alone is worthy for the muse. I say the form complete is worthier far. The female equal with the male I sing. Of life immense in passion, pulse, and power. Cheerful, for freest action formed under the laws divine. The modern man I sing. So, in this poem, Oneself I Sing, we see that Whitman's one's self can be simple and separate. And on the other hand, it can also be democratic. And the word en masse. This is the way Whitman dramatizes the poetic presentation of his ideas about democracy. And similarly, in his Song of Myself, Whitman's myself seems to have been dramatized into a proclamation. He says, I'm large, I contain multitudes. Now let me read aloud the first 2 sections of Whitman's Song of Myself to you. Song of Myself. I celebrate myself and sing myself, and what I assumed you should assume, for every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. I loaf and invite my soul. I lean and loaf at my ease, observing spear of summer grass. My tongue, every atom of my blood, formed from this soil, this air, born here of parents, born here from parents the same, and their parents the same. I, now 37 years old, in perfect health begin, hoping to cease not till death. Crescent schools in abeyance, retiring back a while, suffice at what they are, but never forgotten. I harbored for good or bad, I permit to speak at every hazard, nature without check, with original energy. Whitman opens his long poem, Song of Myself, by saying, I celebrate myself and sing myself. What I assumed you should assume, for every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. This you, as I mentioned last week, remains in the poem to and through the end, though the I is always in the foreground. Not many American poets before Whitman have made so much of the reader as he does throughout Leaves of Grass. Whitman is trying to dissolve the I by emphasizing whatever joins the I to the you, the surrounding world, or the other human beings in general. So his I is interchangeable with the you. The I includes the you. It's all inclusive. If we read his notebooks of 1847 to 1848, we will see a vast, tremendous, and all-assimilating scheme that lies behind his Song of Myself. Whitman says, my right hand is time, my left hand is space. Both are ample. I'm vast. He also says, I'm the poet of the slaves and of the masters of slaves. I'm the poet of the body. I'm the poet of the soul. I'm the poet of the strength and hope. I'm a poet of reality. I'm for sinners and the unlearned. I'm the poet of little things and of babies. I'm the poet of equality. Whitman's mind is oceanic. He wanted to bring all American experiences into his poetry. Professor Justin Kaplan argues in his book that by playing a profound pun with this word, I, Whitman's speaker, I, in this poem, functions both as a seer and as a sayer. So this is the way Whitman obscures the relationship between the reader and the poet. Next two lines, I loathe and invite my soul. I lean and loaf at my ease, observing a spear of summer grass. Who is the I here? Who can be the speaker I inviting his soul? His soul here appears to be something apart from the body. I invite my soul. It is like something as substantial as the body. In line 53 in this poem, Whitman says, clear and sweet is my soul, and clear and sweet is all that is not my soul. In line 422, he says, I'm the poet of the body, and I'm the poet of the soul. And toward the end of this poem, in line 1269 to 70, Whitman says, I have said that the soul is not more than the body, and I have said that the body is not more than the soul. So the soul and the body seems to be of equal importance to Whitman. Perhaps, this is why he wants to sing of the soul and of the body in his poetry. A spear of summer grass, the simple separate leaf of grass, remains the dominant image throughout Whitman's Leaves of Grass. The most fundamental meaning derives from the characteristic of grass to grow not only in single blades, but also in clusters. Keep the image of this picture in your mind. Get a sense of the grass growing in clusters. The grass thus becomes a graphic representation of Whitman's central concept of democracy. The individual in balance with the mass, distinguished singleness in harmony with massive grouping. We have, individual and mass, the singleness and grouping. So the grass commands the poem's central position, and it symbolizes the miracle of the universe in its simplicity. The grass, looks simple, but it symbolizes the miracle of the universe in its simplicity. My tongue, every atom of my blood, formed from this soil, this air, born here of parents, born here from parents the same, and their parents the same. In this line, Whitman not only speaks for America, but also for the whole humankind, Whitman's self, therefore, is not only deeply rooted in the real existence of America, but also merged into a timeless flow of life. Crescent schools in abeyance, retiring back a while, suffice at what they are, but never forgotten. I harbored for good or bad, I permit to speak at every hazard, nature without check, with original energy. Crescent schools refers to second-hand knowledge, not original knowledge. Knowledge we learned from books, from classrooms. In abeyance means not being used at present time. What Whitman wants is to speak at every hazard, nature without check, with original energy. So in other words, in order for nature to speak with original energy, all man-made objects, such as houses, rooms, clothes, universities, etc., must be, at least for the moment, forsaken. In section 2 of Song of Myself, Whitman says, houses and rooms are full of perfumes. Shelves are crowded with perfumes. I breathe the fragrance myself and know it and like it. The distillation would intoxicate me also, but I shall not let it. The atmosphere is not a perfume. It has no taste of the distillation. It is odorless. It is for my mouth forever. I'm in love with it. I will go to the bank by the wood and become undisguised and naked. I'm mad for it to be in contact with me. Well, in this passage, the poet breathes in man-made perfumes, but he prefers the smells of nature. Houses and rooms refers to schools, religion, philosophies, literature. Perfumes are their modes of thought and feeling, suggesting something unnatural, something man-made, not original. It's different from atmosphere. The atmosphere is the thought and feeling excited in a healthy and free individual by direct contact with nature. To be naked here is to strip off the mental trappings from civilization. The symbolism in this passage suggests the opposition between experience from shelved books and experience from nature directly. So in section 1, Whitman announces, three important themes. The self, I celebrate myself and sing myself. Second is the identification of the self with others. What belongs to me as good belongs to you. And third, nature without check, with original energy. So in section 1, Whitman announces three important themes in this poem. And in second section, the self declares its independence of civilization, which is represented by houses and rooms. The poet then indulges in the catalogue of the diverse phenomena of nature, the ecstasies of the self in nature. Then the second section ends with these famous remarks. Stop this day and night with me, and I and you should possess the origin of all poems. You should possess the good of the earth and sun. There are millions of suns left. You should no longer take things as second or third hand, nor look through the eyes of the dead, nor feed on spectres and books. You should not look through my eyes either, nor take things from me. You should listen to all sides and filter them from yourself. So his essential purpose in this poem is to identify himself with the social. Or more specifically, with the democratic en masse of America. The meaning of the poem turns out to be inexhaustible. Its images become multiplayer and resonant. Its form is free and processive, and the self is both lyrical and epical. It is the self of democracy. So it says, I'm large, I contain multitude. Okay, my second topic is Dickinson, the mother of modern American poetry. Emily Dickinson has been regarded as one of America's greatest poets today. But when she died in 1886, at the age of 56, after devoting most of her life to writing poetry, few people knew that, well, she had written nearly 1,800 poems, because only 7 or 8 of her poems were published during her lifetime and anonymously. She was not recognized as a major poet until the 20th century, when modern readers found that her new and innovative lyric voice was unmatched by that of any other 19th century American poet. This is a collection, the poems of Emily Dickinson, edited by Rolfe Franklin, which was published in Cambridge and London, Harvard University Press in 1998. Rolfe Franklin was the director of the Bayneck Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Yale University. He was the foremost scholar of Dickinson's manuscripts, and editor of this authoritative one-volume edition of all the extant poems by Emily Dickinson, 1,789 poems altogether, the largest number ever assembled. And this is a great book, The American Renaissance, Art and Expression in the Age of Emerson and Whitman, written by Mathieson, which was published by Oxford University Press in 1941. It was a great book, a book reviewed in Saturday Review sense. This book, is perhaps the most profound work of lyric criticism on historical principles by any modern American. Mathieson, professor at Yale and Harvard University. He has centered his evaluation of the great age of American literature around the chief works of Emerson, Thoreau, Hawthorne, Melville, and Whitman, but not including Emily Dickinson, because he thinks that Dickinson's poems are much more authentically in the metaphysical tradition, and that her conceits are subordinated to a central issue. So Dickinson does not have any of Emerson's range of a social critic. So Emily Dickinson was not considered as a major writer in this book. But in another great book called Beneath the American Renaissance, also published by Harvard University Press in 1989, the author David Reynolds argues that Dickinson, arguably the greatest female poet, has not yet been discussed in terms of social and literary flowering that occurred in women's culture during the 1850s. The American Woman's Renaissance. This book is also considered a great critical work. A book review in New York Times book review says, this book is an original piece of work that gives literary canon and its context a good shaking. Also a groundbreaking book. Professor Reynolds says, the fact is that Dickinson's poetry is most characteristic of her era's best women's writing, in its extraordinary flexibility of tone, its refusal to rest comfortably in individual genre roles. And he concludes that, well, Emily Dickinson was not a solitary woman rebel, but rather the highest product of rebellious American sisterhood. So he places Emily Dickinson in the center among all these great writers of the 19th century America. So if Whitman was considered the father of modern American poetry, then Emily Dickinson was well worth the title of mother of modern American poetry. Now, let me introduce, well, briefly, the life of Emily Dickinson. Emily Dickinson was born in Amherst, Massachusetts, to a prominent and prosperous family. Along with her younger sister Lavinia and older brother Austin, she experienced a quiet and reserved family life. Although Dickinson didn't present 19th century politics, economics, social issues directly in the foreground of her poetry, she lived in a family environment that was immersed in them. Her grandfather was one of the founders of Amherst College. Edward Dickinson, her father, was a lawyer, the treasurer of Amherst College, an active town official, served in the General Court of Massachusetts, the state Senate, and the United States House of Representatives. Emily Dickinson's mother, Emily Norcross Dickinson, was not a powerful presence in her life. Both parents were intended to raise their daughter to be a cultured Christian woman responsible for a family of her own. But Dickinson was so individualistic. She didn't fall into step with the conventional piety, domesticity, and social duty. Given this background, which included an education more extensive than usual for young women of that period, 2 years at Amherst Academy and 1 year at Mount Holyoke Female Seminary, we can assume that, well, the intellectual and social life of the Amherst College community was available to Emily Dickinson. As a schoolgirl, Emily Dickinson was a young woman who was shy but fun-loving, not beautiful but somewhat striking, and always very neat in dress. But for whatever reasons, we do not know clearly, Dickinson began to lead a rather solitary life about 1853, when he was 23 years old. A letter of that year says, "I do not go from home." The fact remains that from age 30 on, her life was essentially withdrawn from society. Her solitude does not seem to have taken a morbid turn, anything unhealthy psychologically, until the death of her father in 1874. Actually, apart from an excursion to Philadelphia and Washington, and several brief trips to Boston to see a doctor about an eye disorder called exotropia, Dickinson lived all her life in her father's house. This is a picture of Amherst, Massachusetts. Dickinson's homestead is in the middle of the town. We see the house in the red circle is Dickinson homestead. And a house in the blue circle is called Evergreen, a house Emily Dickinson's father built for her brother. These pictures of the Emily Dickinson house on Main Street, Amherst, Massachusetts. Well, the picture on the right, I took the picture in the year 2002, when the house was still under being fixed up. But I was lucky to be allowed to take some pictures in the house. These are pictures I took in Dickinson's bedroom, and we see her single bed. And what interests me most is the tiny desk which Emily Dickinson produced nearly 2,000 poems, short poems. And this is a house Edward Dickinson built for his son. It's of Gothic wall style, but it was not open to the public when I visited, but I was allowed to go in and took some pictures inside. So we can see from these pictures the quality of the house. See, the wood was excellent. Dickinson's adult life was shot on external incident, but it was long on imagination, because she devoted most of her life to writing poetry. Dickinson rarely received visitors. In her mature years, she never went out. She dressed only in white and became known as the myth of Amherst. This picture I took in Dickinson's homestead. It is Dickinson's single extant white dress. Only 7 or 8 of her poems were published during her lifetime. Unlike Walt Whitman, who became public bard, public poet of his age, Emily Dickinson chose to live internally, within the confines of her home, yet with the limitless expansion of her imagination. Choice she was well aware of in her poem, I dwelt in possibility. I dwelt in possibility rather than in a house. I always say I dwelt in a house of possibilities. I dwelt in possibility. A fairer house than prose, more numerous of windows, superior for doors. Possibility is a conceit here, a far-fetched comparison, comparing the possibility of her imagination, of her poetry, to her house. So she dwelt in possibility, in her imagination, in her poetical world, which is more beautiful than prose. Prose is different from verse, writes about facts of the limited world here and now. So her house of possibility is superior to the house of fact. It has more outlets onto the world. It has more windows, more doors. And this poem is a good example of Dickinson's power of compression, her ability to give the most possible meaning in the fewest possible words. The reader must supply a good part of the sentence, but the meaning is never really obscured. In this poem, Dickinson is speaking about the possibilities of imagination and the limitations of reason. He chooses to live internally in her house of poetry of imagination rather than the house of prose of the here and now. Her solitary life does not restrict her creative sensibilities. Dickinson wrote nearly 1,800 poems altogether, and her collected works, plus a lot of correspondence, letters, are filled with intense feelings, from terror to joy. She just simplified her life so that doing without was a means of being within. It seemed as if, well, she was attempting to redefine the meaning of deprivation, and because being denied something provided a sharper, more intense focus on the true meaning of life. So she says in her poems, water is taught by thirst, and success is counted sweeter by those who never succeed. Dickinson's poems also revealed her intimate knowledge of the Bible, classical myth, the works of Shakespeare. In addition, she admired works of transcendentalists, Thoreau and Emerson. And she also read the Brontes, the Brownings, John Keats, George Eliot. Biblical ideas, subjects, allusions, imagery abound in her poetry. Biblical quotations in her letters and poems exceed references to any other source or author. In her letter to Higginson, she even wrote, "While Shakespeare remains, literature is firm." Poem number 741, she wrote, Hamlet to himself were Hamlet, had not Shakespeare wrote. Hamlet was nothing if William Shakespeare hadn't written about him. So it was William Shakespeare who created the character Hamlet. Okay, now let's have a discussion over some of her poems. This is my letter to the world. Okay, now I'll read aloud the poem for you. This is my letter to the world that never wrote to me. The simple news that nature told with tender majesty. Her message is committed to hands I cannot see. For love of her, sweet countrymen, judge tenderly of me. This poem is believed to have been written in 1862, the year Emily Dickinson began to send her letter to Thomas Higginson, a minister, a writer, and an editor. This is a picture of Thomas Higginson with his daughter. Although Higginson didn't succeed in helping Dickinson publish her poems during her lifetime, he did offer her advice and support throughout Dickinson's prolific writing career. And this poem was finally published 4 years after the death of Emily Dickinson in a collection edited by Thomas Higginson and called Poems by Emily Dickinson, which was published in 1890. This poem is strikingly descriptive of Dickinson's lyric career. We know that Dickinson wrote about 1,800 poems, and only 7 or 8 were published during her lifetime. But those were all greatly altered by editors who did not always comprehend Dickinson's unconventional poetic style. She might have been frustrated by the poor reception of her work from her contemporaries, but she also believed that true genius is often misunderstood in its own time. Dickinson was very competent about her own poetry writing. As the poem indicates, Dickinson kept writing her poetry with the confidence that someday in the future, its proper audience will judge tenderly of me. The first 2 lines, this is my letter to the world that never wrote to me. Well, these 2 opening lines give us an impression that the poet is aware of the indifference of the world. And the poet-speaker is isolated. She is shut away from the world that she sends her letter to. The simple news that nature told with tender majesty. What does the simple news refer to? Why is nature capitalized here? If the simple news refers to my letter, this poem, then nature is, of course, personified and tells us the simple news before the poet writes it down in her letter, in her poem to the world. The simple news, therefore, refers to both the poet's letter, her poem, and nature's news. And this is, well, perhaps the way EmilyDickinson identifies herself with nature. Her letter to the world, from which she is shut away from, will be able to transmit such news about nature as she has perhaps received through her senses. It seems as if, well, nature tells her the simple news tenderly, majestically, or splendidly, or wonderfully, or terrifically, or marvelously. The poet, well, speaker just takes down the tender message told by nature in her letter, in her poem to the world. Her message is committed to hands I cannot see. Her message refers to nature's message. But why is her message transferred to people she cannot see? Some critics argue that Dickinson did not write for publication. Dickinson even says in one of her early poems that publication is an auction. Publication is an auction. But in the last two lines here in this poem, the poet feels confident that her sweet countrymen will judge of her poetry tenderly because they all love nature and its message. For love of her, sweet countrymen, judge tenderly of me. For love of her, sweet countrymen, judge tenderly of me. Perhaps, we can also say that although EmilyDickinson is well aware of the indifference of her countrymen, she begs them to judge her tenderly. And this reading leads to another interpretation of this poem. The poem perhaps reflects the poet's, contradictory attitude toward fame. She states that publication is an auction, but here she implores the people to judge her poetry tenderly. Dickinson is sometimes a person we find very difficult to figure out. I'm Nobody, Who Are You? It's another famous poem by EmilyDickinson. I'm nobody, who are you? Are you nobody too? Then there is pair of us. Don't tell, they advertise. You know, how dreary to be somebody, how public, like a frog, to tell one's name a livelong June to an admiring bog. Now I have two questions. First, what is, Dickinson's argument in this poem? What is the central metaphor? How does the metaphor reinforce the poet's presentation of her argument? The poem is written in a form of dramatic monologue. in which the I, the speaker I, addresses another imaginary nobody, another imaginary person. The I and you seem to be compared, to be likened to a nice pair of nobodies. And they are different from those who attempt to advertise themselves. They don't advertise themselves. They find it boring to be somebody. They don't want to be somebody. And make up for their minds and not to be public. They don't want to be public. They don't want to be public like a frog, croaking to an admiring bark to advertise themselves. So the poem argues that there are advantages in being away from the constant glare of spotlight. They don't want to be public. They don't want to be somebody in the eyes of others. Moreover, the poem might also suggest the poet's humorous contempt for humanity and her recognition of her own superiority. The metaphorical irony of the concepts of somebody and nobody in this poem lies in the convincing evidence that it was undeserved popularity rather than the recognition itself which Emily Dickinson condemned. Thus, how dreary to be somebody. Question number 2. Emily Dickinson and Walt Whitman were contemporaries and are now regarded as two greatest poets of the 19th century America. Whitman says that I celebrate myself and sing myself, while Emily Dickinson prefers to ask, I'm nobody, who are you? I'm nobody, who are you? What is your impression of these two poets? As I mentioned, well, Whitman has been called the father of modern American poetry, and Emily Dickinson the mother of modern American poetry. But they were different from each other. Unlike Walt Whitman, who attempted to advertise himself by even publishing book reviews for his own poetry, Dickinson hid her nearly 1,800 poems in a drawer in her bedroom at home. Whitman tried to include everyone and everything in his poetry, while Emily Dickinson's short poems turn on internal experiences. Where Whitman's poems will grow toward a single organic epic, Dickinson's almost 1,800 small poems stand as distinct and contradictory statements. Whitman abandoned conventional themes, dealing with the world that he really knew, a world with real things, with steam engines, wars, and sex, while Emily Dickinson was satisfied with her meditation over intellectual, metaphysical details. When she was asked whether she had read Walt Whitman, she said that she had never read Whitman, but was told that Whitman was disgraceful because Whitman wrote about the body. In terms of poetic form, Whitman created a new form of free verse, which is undisciplined by convention or tradition. He opened up a space completely by breaking off the line limits, so that he could say anything he wanted to say and could bring in everyday particulars. But Emily Dickinson was writing in a very small form. As a result, Whitman became a public bar Well, Emily Dickinson turned out to be a poet who wrote her letters to the world and never wrote to her. Okay, now we'll have assignments for next lecture. Practice reading aloud Dickinson's poems discussed today. Of course, well, you are encouraged to learn them by heart. Write a journal on your impression of Whitman and Dickinson on the basis of your understanding of Whitman's Oneself I Sing and Emily Dickinson's I'm Nobody. That's all for today. Thank you very much.